All right. Well, happy Friday again. We'll get started. You're here with the USC Marshall School of Business Executive Education team. This course is optimizing culture under crisis conditions. We have a chat box and we encourage you all to engage. And the chat box on the bottom will turn orange when there's a chat that's available. If it's not orange, feel free to chime in and just ask any questions you might have along the course of this webinar. If you'd just like to tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're coming from, what location you're logging in from, and what industry you're in, we'd love to hear that. This is an active webinar where you'll participate in engagement polls, chat box, and breakout rooms to do activities with others. We invite you to actively participate in this webinar in multiple modalities, whichever you feel most comfortable with. Listening, using the chat box below, or video using your webcam with your microphones on. But please, feel free to mute yourself if you'd like to. The recording of this webinar, copies of the slides presented, along with the resource sheet will be emailed to you by end of next week. On today's webinar are my fabulous executive education colleagues, including our webinar presenter, Terry Wolf. They'll be responding to your chat questions during our webinar. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Tim Blakesley, the Assistant Dean of the Marshall School of Business Executive Education. Tim, I now turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jenny, and it's my pleasure to welcome both our speaker today, but also everyone who has joined us here on a Friday. We thank you for taking time to spend it here with Marshall Executive Education. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Terry is one of those unique individuals in our world that bridges both the professional consulting world and the academic world. Terry is a successful and accomplished professional consultant in strategic planning, human performance development, performance measurement, executive team development, organizational assessment, and leading change. Terry spent many years as an independent consultant serving clients primarily in aerospace, high-tech, biotech, and healthcare sectors. But we're very pleased to call him one of our own now. He is here with us at the Marshall School of Executive Education, but he has also taught a variety of leadership and management development classes within Marshall's MBA and MS programs. So it is with a great deal of pleasure that I turn it over to you, Terry. Take us away.
Great. Thank you, Tim, and welcome everybody. So greetings and hello to each of you from where I am to wherever you may be. You may notice here, depending on how you're doing the video on this, that you've caught me in one of my shaggy dog styles. I normally get my hair cut on a 4-week basis, and I think we're looking at week 11 now. So my son and I are competing with each other for the Shaggy Dog Award. And yesterday he asked me if he's got dark brown hair, and yesterday he asked me if I could dye it red for him. So we have to take culmination pictures for him as he moves on from 6th to 7th grade, and we have to do that this afternoon. So we'll take one before the coloring and one after the coloring, just to be sure. Thank you for joining us today for the 5th in our series on organizational and workplace issues in the times of COVID-19. We've had a variety of issues that we've talked about so far in our previous 4 modules, and today the special focus is on the role and impact of organizational culture during times of crisis and uncertainty. So culture is a notion that, in the depth or breadth of the history of management literature is actually fairly recent. It was really popularized in 1982 with the publication of 2 landmark pieces, one by a couple of McKinsey consultants called In Search of Excellence, and another by 2 Vanderbilt University professors called Corporate Cultures. And that really set in motion the whole popular and contemporary interest in culture, taking us to the point of the realization that culture is actually a source of competitive advantage. So as far as our session today and the time that we will have, a couple of things that we'll be looking at. We're going to engage in a number of different polls and take a few moments after each poll to just kind of reflect on what the data is telling us. And I just want to remind you that polls are completely anonymous, and so we will all derive the most benefit if you provide us with candid responses to the polling questions. I will then introduce an approach to the understanding of organizational culture. This is an approach that was strongly rooted in work from the University of Michigan, and it's one that we actually use quite frequently in our executive programs with our corporate custom clients. We find that this approach identifies some useful categories for thinking about culture. And these categories are things that we could call archetypes, cultural archetypes. But it also helps us identify some specific dimensions of culture. And these can be used for both understanding culture as well as managing culture change initiatives. So in particular, for our purposes today, we're interested in how leaders and managers can utilize different levers of cultural influence as elements of their response to a crisis condition. We'll draw upon recent news articles, so the currently observed cultural practices that you see there. We'll draw upon some recent news articles to illustrate how the responses of various companies and leaders reflect differences, not only in their strategies and business models, but also in their cultural archetypes. With these archetypes in mind, we'll conduct a couple of more polls to get a sense of what you, as our participants, are thinking about your own organization and how your own organizations and by way of their culture are responding to the current situation. And then finally, we'll utilize a breakout room to crowdsource potential cultural practices that can enhance organizational effectiveness under crisis conditions. So here we're really looking to you as people in the field, trying to deal with the situation in real time. What are you seeing happening in your own organizations, and what do you think could be some good, effective practices to help organizations better adapt under the current conditions? So throughout our time together, as Jenny already indicated, please take advantage of the chat function to pose questions and share your comments and reactions. While we may not be able to get to all of them in real time, we will look at them and follow up as appropriate after the webinar. So let's get started with a couple of quick polls. And Tim, that's a cue to you. The first one is to look at culture as a determinant of employee satisfaction. So success and satisfaction. So the first question is, to what extent do you regard culture as an important determinant of your own organization's success? And very important, somewhat important, or not at all important. Okay, the data is sort of suggesting that we might be preaching to the choir here, that everybody sees culture as valuable to the organization's success. So we've got a pretty good response rate there. That basically the primary indicator is that the majority of people see, everybody sees it as important. The majority clearly see it as very important. Okay, Tim, maybe we could go on to the second poll. Okay, so the second poll, how important is your organization's culture to your personal workplace satisfaction? So we've got a pretty good response here. So it appears that most people regard culture is very important to their personal workplace satisfaction. A few somewhat important, and obviously I would be very curious to learn about the one person who sees it as not at all important, but we won't put that one person on the spot. But we looked at this in terms of, is culture a determinant of organizational success, and is culture a determinant of your personal workplace satisfaction? And it looks like for the most part, people are in agreement that culture is clearly an important variable, whether it's in relationship to success or satisfaction. Okay, so what does the research tell us? So it's been said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And so with that in mind, a strong culture can clearly function as a competitive advantage, especially insofar as culture is extremely difficult to imitate. And so that's one of the challenges in strategy, is how do you create a strategy that is very difficult to imitate? And culture is one of those critical factors that help to make your strategy inimitable or difficult to imitate. So we can look at a couple of very popular and well-known illustrations, Southwest Airlines and Trader Joe's. Rivals have consistently struggled to create comparable economic returns both to Southwest and Trader Joe's. In both cases, their strategies actually are reasonably transparent, but it's their respective cultures that really sets them apart. It's sort of in contrast, we can look at Enron and Arthur Andersen and what were the underlying cultural characteristics that contributed to their respective downfalls. And kind of interesting to note that a verb was created in the Enron days to be Enroned, which was the consequence of having been negatively affected by the inappropriate actions or decisions by leaders or managers. So in short, we can put forward a reasonably plausible argument that culture is a driving force in creating and sustaining competitive advantage. It significantly affects employee attitudes, engagement, commitment, satisfaction, and thereby directly impacting some core human capital processes of attraction, recruitment, and retention. So now let's take a moment and just get some sense of your own attitudes about how your own organizations have responded to COVID-19. So Tim, if you could launch the next poll, please. So you can choose all that apply from these choices, but in its response to COVID-19, would you say that your organization has been more collaborative, more innovative, more procedural or policy and procedure based, more performance driven, or none of the above? Okay, very interesting to see just sort of the pattern and the flow of these results. A couple of folks outstanding in terms of replying, but so clearly what we can see here is that if you look at the sum total of the percentage points on the far right-hand side, it greatly exceeds 100%. So clearly people are seeing that within their own organizations, responses in multiple categories, from collaborative most especially, and then innovative, and then procedural and performance driven at about the same. So it's interesting also just to reflect on, if you believe they're becoming more collaborative, what is it in your own minds? And you could drop something into chat if you like, but what is it about the current situation that you think is driving your organization to be more collaborative and equally more innovative? So given your responses to the last poll question in terms of what you see going on within your own organization, to what extent do you agree with the direction? Do you completely agree with it? Do you moderately agree, disagree, or completely disagree? Or the question just doesn't even apply? Okay, so we've got a pretty strong pattern here. So for the most part, most people saw their organizations becoming more collaborative and more entrepreneurial or innovative. And that for the most part, people are in agreement with what they're observing within their own organizations in terms of the responses to the situation. Okay, so given the polling, we have some good and interesting perspectives on our collective reflections on the role of culture broadly and the role of culture within our own organization specifically. Okay, so with this as a backdrop, I'm called the Competing Values Framework for Understanding Organizational Culture. So the Competing Values Framework is derived from extensive research at the University of Michigan. And it is an approach to understanding organizational culture. In no ways would I make the assertion that it is the approach. However, it appeals to me because it is both a strong theoretical and empirical foundation, and it actually has been found to be quite useful in managing organizational change initiatives. And it's particularly useful because it teases out 6 different levers that can be used to influence organizational change initiatives. So we've used this model extensively in with our corporate clients, and especially have used it extensively in the healthcare space. So the Competing Values Framework is built upon 2 underlying dimensions that are reflected in different approaches to organizational leadership, management, and the measurement of success, among other variables. These 2 underlying dimensions are the relative emphasis on control versus flexibility, and the relative orientation towards either internal focus or external focus. When combined, this allows for the development of a 2x2 matrix within which we can identify 4 cultural archetypes that reflect the underlying tensions brought about through these competing values, as we can show here. So if you find an organization that is very flexible, but with a primary internal focus, it's really a team-based organizational culture. A lot of emphasis on collaboration, a lot of emphasis on cohesion, a lot of emphasis on building morale, a lot of emphasis on human resource or human capital development. Alternatively, an organization that is also very flexible but has more of an external focus is an entrepreneurial culture. And the entrepreneurial culture here, we see there a significant interest in opportunities for new product development, new service development, scanning the horizon to see where new opportunities might present themselves. When an organization has more of a control orientation and an internal focus, we can call that more of a mechanistic or bureaucratic. I use the word mechanistic because it helps me create a nice acronym, but bureaucratic might be a better word for you in terms of thinking about what we mean here. So here it's much more policy and procedures, rules driven, respecting hierarchy and things of that nature. And then finally, an organization that is external focused and control, it's really around drivers of external competition, focusing on performance metrics like market share, revenue growth, number of new customers procured, and things of that nature. So it's really tracking metrics where the objective of the metrics is really to track growth. So Each of these archetypes also reflects an underlying emphasis on one of 4 different values, and that really characterize the organization's guiding principles. So the underlying value for the team organization is collaborate. The underlying value for the entrepreneurial organization is create. The underlying value for the mechanistic or bureaucratic organization is control. And then the underlying value for the performance organization is compete. And so we can summarize those, quite simply in a little chart here. So we know from research and experience that for the most part, we won't find pure forms in real organizations. In other words, 100% team or 100% innovative or 100% competition-based, et cetera. Virtually every organization will reflect some blend of each of the 4 archetypes. However, any given organization will probably show a predisposition towards 1 or possibly 2 of the 4 types. So for example, investment banking may score very high on the performance archetype, which is the compete is the underlying value, whereas government agencies would be, and bureaucracies would be the classic reference for the mechanistic model. Very progressive and innovative tech firms such as Pixar may more closely reflect the entrepreneurial archetype and the underlying value of create. And a firm like Microsoft, especially under its more recent direction under CEO Satya Nadella, is in a very public way moving more from what they call a know-it-all to a learn-it-all culture, premised on a growth mindset as a basis for increasing openness and welcoming input into problem solving and decision making. So each of these reflect a leadership preference for a selected dominant underlying cultural value that plays itself out in the organization's purpose, its strategy, and ultimately is a driver of its success. So with this framework in mind, let's see how you think about your own organizations. We'll do this through another poll, and keep in mind that, again, these polls are anonymous. So which cultural archetype, and Tim, you could launch this one, which cultural archetype is more like your own organization? And this is a bit of a forced choice if we think that any organization is driven by a predominant underlying value. Okay, a nice distribution, almost equal distribution between team and entrepreneurial. I don't know how many folks here are actually associated with the Marshall School as alums or whatever, but we've got the Greif Center, of course, which very much focuses on entrepreneurship. Okay, we'll close that one out so that we see a reasonably good balance between team and entrepreneurial, but participants also have performance-driven and bureaucratic organizations as well. So now these are your thoughts. Under conditions of crisis or uncertainty, and again, it's a forced choice, do you think an organization should be more team or collaborative, entrepreneurial or creative, mechanistic or control-oriented, or performance and competitive-oriented? Okay, while we're getting some more responses here, what I'd like you to do is use the chat function. And if you could briefly just sort of share why you think the way you do. Why, for those of you who have chosen team, why under conditions of crisis or uncertainty do you think it's more appropriate or useful for an organization to become collaborative or entrepreneurial or mechanistic, et cetera? Okay, so clearly people see that predominantly, looks like roughly 50% of the responses see it should be more collaborative, 25% more entrepreneurial. So a few thoughts on that would be great.
Yeah, Terry, we have a few responses here in the chat. I just wanted to point out. Gita was saying we need more ideas, teams work. T. Lobel said, in a crisis, teams solve problems better. Roberto said, teamwork and taking care of people's emotional side is critical at a time like this. Matt said, collective responsibility. Mary said, time for boldness rather than contraction. Act, don't freeze. And then Tim Sandoval said, because your team is critical to the success of the organizations, teams can also be entrepreneurial. Ahmad, okay. Collaborate and entrepreneurial aren't mutually exclusive.
So the framing question is, what are we seeing? Basically, as we're looking at the popular press or watching the news, it's just replete with illustrations of organizations and how they're responding to the current crisis situation. And so just some illustrations that I've extracted that in my mind can be readily mapped on to the competing values framework in these 4 different cultural archetypes are illustrations such as the following. So do you see that come in now, the team collaborate? Okay, great.
Yes.
Okay, so just some evidence that we're seeing is deploying humanistic management practices and an employee-first attitude. We're seeing a lot of discussions around providing management providing guidance and supporting and addressing the emotional, the economic, and the food insecurity needs of workers and their families. In the entrepreneurial and create, unemployed workers banding together to make personal protective equipment, rapid prototyping and innovative responses for contact tracing. And this is where I mentioned, for example, Viterbi colleagues and Google and Apple and Microsoft are all engaging in how do we use this technology, like our cell phone technology, basically to track proximity to somebody who may be carrying either the virus or perhaps, I think, I'm trying to remember the location now. I think it's a restaurant or a bar in Texas as they're reopening, or maybe New Orleans, that when you come into into the establishment, you have to give your name and phone number, so that if they discover that somebody actually was carrying the virus and had been a customer, then they could very quickly and readily track down people who may have been exposed. And retooling ventilator and other critical healthcare equipment. This is GM in particular has been noted for that. And then obviously in the biotech sector, there's new vaccine development and testing. And then from a government point of view, all of us are very dependent for ongoing social distancing and stay-at-home guidance. And this is really around policies and procedures and recommendations to help keep us safe. And then we're seeing articles on the rise of governmental strongmen in various countries around the world. And then finally, in the performance or compete category, companies are completely rethinking their business models for new forms of competing under conditions of spatial distancing and work from home directives. So the whole business landscape is being transformed, and which is leading to a transformation, innovative transformations. How do we work with our people transformations? How do we address issues around guidance and control, and then people completely rethinking their business models. And this is where I was saying more serendipitous than by plan, but as we reflect back on our various workshops that we've done through this Fight On Through Uncertain Times series, the very first two that we did were around maximizing remote work and leading virtual teams, and just some things that the kinds of issues that were being addressed here, a lot of them were around supporting workers in anxiety reduction and helping workers get comfortable with working and performing under completely new or novel conditions, and trying to balance, now I've got to homeschool my child while I'm also trying to get my work done and things of that nature. And then we did a session on managing biases and unlocking creativity with an emphasis on the growth or learner mindset and how identifying how biases can impede our creativity, and then explore how being curious, that notion of curiosity, can open up an array of new possibilities. And so that's in that create, the entrepreneurial create category. And then we did a session on maintaining performance engagement. And while taking into account employee well-being, we also need to continue to focus on how do we monitor performance and attend to the challenges of maintaining a work focus when people are remote and in very uncertain times. And then for those of us from the Office of Executive Education, for example, we've seen that even within the Marshall School, a tremendous amount of effort has been put forth to ensure that staff and faculty maintain their productivity. I didn't necessarily put these in priority order so much as that this has been happening. So they are concerned about, what can we do? How do we modify the infrastructure so that people can continue to be productive while working under very different conditions? Ensuring that staff remain in compliance with policies and procedures. There are certain things that obviously have to be attended to or adhered to, whether you're at home, working from home, or working on campus, and that all employees feel supported by their management in the school. So really we see that within the Marshall School, we've been tapping into at least 3 of these 4. Yeah, I suppose you could probably put some issues in there around creativity, because we've all had to figure out how to adapt to conducting classes and doing business in an online format. Okay, just yesterday I was on a call with a major biotech company talking about their leadership development program. And it's just kind of interesting to reflect on that discussion. So if you think about the biotech sector, their lifeblood is really around creating new therapeutics, new medications, et cetera. So they fundamentally exist in the entrepreneurial or create space, and their survival will be short-lived if they don't. But equally, they've got to keep an eye on the bottom line. They've got to keep an eye on the stock market. They've got to keep an eye on how do they keep their investors happy and things of that nature. But the biotech space is a very highly regulated space. And so they have to pay lots of attention to federal guidelines and federal laws and regulations related to clinical trials and introducing new drugs and therapeutics, et cetera. But what became critical about the conversation we were having yesterday is that in this particular organization, it's a very large, very successful biotech firm, but their history is in very much of a siloed or functional organizational perspective, and they haven't had much of a historical need for really focusing on kind of the team or collaboration perspective. A lot of individual contributors as scientists, but now they're finding that they need to collaborate more effectively. So in response to COVID, on the one hand, they're trying to launch new initiatives in relationship to, for example, vaccine creation, but more importantly, in terms of, especially in relationship to the leadership development program that we were talking about, it's not that they don't know anything about this space so much as they're being confronted with challenges in this space that they've just never had to deal with before. On the one hand, managing their own anxiety, but then as leaders, but then also how do they support their people in managing their anxiety and all of the issues around providing support under these new, unusual, unprecedented conditions. Okay, so we'd like you actually to take a moment and do a brief breakout and sort of address the question, what responses have you seen within your own organizations to our current situation? So Tim is going to put you into breakout groups. We certainly, it's not required, but we certainly hope that you'll engage in the breakout. And two basic questions. What responses have you seen within your own organizations? And so not just are they more collaborative or more competitive or more entrepreneurial, but what specifically have you observed? And would you say that what you're observing, the types of behaviors you're observing, are consistent with or different from your dominant organization's culture? So we'd like to give you about 5 to 7 minutes. And if you could take some time, join a breakout room, and then you can share some thoughts in chat, and then we'll try and take maybe just 1 or 2 inputs. We'll ask somebody to come off mute and take 1 or 2 inputs after we reconvene. So if we could give maybe 7 minutes for this. What I'd like to do is 2 things. One, Tim posted a message. Please feel free to share in the chat maybe some of what came up for you in your discussions. And then I've asked Jenny to select 1 or 2 people to just maybe briefly share some of what came up in the discussion in the group. So Jenny.
All right, let's start with Ahmad. If he'd like to share what we discussed in our breakout, that would be great. Ahmad, if you'd like to unmute yourself and share, that'd be great.
There we go. Well, first of all, Jenny, it was a great conversation, so thank you. It's nice meeting you. What I shared with Jenny was that in many ways I have 2 opportunities, with my firm, one of which is to really look at what we're doing and how we are adjusting and adapting. But, my team is, we're used to being virtual. And so the opportunity to make changes and be flexible is kind of already wedded into our business processes. However, because we do take on clients and have worked with clients that are having challenges because they're larger and kind of moving into in dealing with this crisis. And even when I look at higher ed, which are some of my clients, a lot of times, by kind of exporting themselves into the virtual space, that's adapting, but it's not necessarily innovating. But I think right now people are seeing these moments as innovation, when really what it is just kind of a technical response to adaptation. And that's fine, you know, but really for the innovation to take place, there has to be a chance for more reflection, more of a creative processes of seeing what truly can emerge and be options, you know, for moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you for that. Jenny, maybe if we can get one
more.
Yeah, just one more if we can do it very quickly.
Perfect. Elizabeth, would you like to share?
Oh, sure. I just somehow I did something wrong. Anyway, I work for a company that's very human centric, and I have been delighted that our company has really just reinforced our existing culture. So we've always been very much about our people. And I think in these times of COVID, we're all the more about our people. It's really underscored what a great company and what a great culture we have. Thanks.
Okay, terrific.
Thank you both, Ahmad and Elizabeth, for sharing. We appreciate it.
Yes, great, thank you. Okay, I'm gonna hopefully move us forward. Yes, okay. So one of the really valuable aspects of this competing values framework is that it identifies 6 different dimensions, the far left column that you see here, of culture. And each of these different dimensions can function as a useful tool or lever for influencing culture and driving organizational change. So the 6 dimensions are what are the dominant characteristics of the organization or the culture? What's the leadership style? The glue that holds it together, and the climate. And the climate is different from culture. Climate is sort of the general feel. If you think of the weather climate, it's sticky outside, or it's chilly outside, or it's warm or humid. It's really kind of what's the feel in the organization at a moment in time, and then what are the criteria for success, and then how would you characterize the management style? So I'm just going to illustrate one of these, and I want to use it as a foundation for one more breakout before we conclude. So if we look at the team archetype, for example, the dominant characteristics are that it's friendly and like a family. The leadership style is more leaders as mentors or perhaps as respected elders, people who are looked to for their wisdom and guidance. The glue that holds the team culture together is loyalty and commitment. The climate and the feel is characterized by an attitude of human resource development, building cohesions, and building morale. The criteria for success are around customer sensitivity and concern for your people, and then the management style is really a teamwork focus and maybe a consensus-driven, maybe not to the extreme, but a consensus-oriented management style. So just to give you a feel of the flavor of what these 6 different characteristics or dimensions can look like across a particular culture. And I can just fill this in. I'm not going to go across and read all of this. It's quite a bit to take in. But actually, we are going to provide this this chart in a PDF format and send it out to all of those who have joined us today. So, but just if you look at the dominant characteristics as an illustration, for a team, it's friendly and like a family, but in an entrepreneurial culture, it's very dynamic, creative, and orientation towards risk. In the mechanistic, formalized, and procedure-driven, and then in the performance-oriented compete culture, it's around results and very purposely seeking out people who are very competitive. So I'm going to set us up for a breakout, and then I'll put us back onto this slide as a point of reference. And I think Tim is able to push it out to you through the chat function. With these various dimensions or levers in mind, for each of the 4 archetypes, we want to kind of crowdsource some ideas for how organizations and cultures can be more effective in the face of COVID-19. For example, under conditions such as we're facing now, the crisis and the uncertainty, in what ways, might we better check in on our people and support their individual and teamwork? That would be the team orientation. In what ways might we look for opportunities to modify or improve work processes or develop new product or service offerings? That's more of the create approach. How might we strengthen or enforce policies and procedures, partly in service of controlling, but also policies and procedures can also help to allay anxiety. So how can we strengthen or enforce policies and procedures in a valid and in a supportive way? And then how might we modify or develop and then discuss new performance requirements and expectations of people, taking into account the new reality of ambiguity and uncertainty. So just some illustrations, that would be kind of the compete piece. So just some illustrations. What I'd like you to do is we're going to put you into a quick breakout. And if you could just choose one of the 4 archetypes, choose team or choose entrepreneurial, and just explore for a few minutes among yourselves how you might identify some useful best practices in the face of COVID-19 for strengthening a team approach or an entrepreneurial approach, mechanistic or performance. So if somebody could maybe capture, scribe some of what the team talks about, and then you could share that back with us in chat, that would be great. So Tim, if you could put people into breakouts, and you'll probably have about 5 minutes for this. Okay, seen quite a few people come back. I'm not sure if there's some groups still working or we have a little bit of attrition, but just to get us forward, move us forward, we would love it from a time point of view. We really can't get some verbal sharing, but if people could drop some comments into the chat function regarding your responses to ways we might be able to be more effectively in a collaborate, create, control, or compete context, that would be great. We really appreciate that. And then, overall, we've had a very interesting and rich discussion around organizational culture under conditions of crisis, and have crowdsourced some ideas on how to optimize culture in uncertain times. As we wrap it up, there are 2 pieces here. One is that I would love it if you would use the chat function personally. To just, one insight that you can take away from this session. If you could, before departing, maybe something that you've gathered, something that was interesting, caught your attention, that you learned, etc., just drop something in the chat function. And while we're doing that, I'm just going to turn it over to Jenny, and she can wrap up the whole session for us. And thank you all very much for giving us a pressure hour of your time on a Friday afternoon, and I hope you have a great weekend. So Jenny?
Perfect. Thank you, Terry. Thank you, everyone, for participating. I just want to thank everyone for joining us today and actively participating and learning together. Our next webinar is on the power of mindfulness, resiliency, realignment, and that will be on Thursday, May 28th at 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time with Alan Weiss. Once again, on behalf of the Marshall School Business Executive Education Team, we want to thank you for your time today and hope you and your family stay safe during this time. Bye, Don.